So this is Philosophy 6 at Las Positas College. I thought I would start giving you a quick introduction to section 3.1 in the Hurley on fallacies in general. So Hurley starts by defining what is a fallacy and says that a fallacy is just a defect in an argument that arises from a mistake in reasoning or the creation of an illusion that makes a bad argument appear good. So fallacies are just mistakes in reasoning. To be honest, they're probably also sometimes deliberate attempts to get us to believe something that we ought not to believe. But we want to be aware of these consistent patterns of attempted arguments that use bad evidence to infer a certain conclusion. Because if we're aware of these types, then we can do a better job of not believing things that aren't well supported. There are two kinds of fallacies that we want to be aware of. The first is a formal fallacy. So a formal fallacy is a fallacy where the error in reasoning can be identified just by the form of the argument itself. And Hurley gives us some examples here. Here's an example. The argument starts out with an if-then conditional. If apes are intelligent, then apes can solve puzzles. That's premise 1. Premise 2, apes can solve puzzles. And then the conclusion, therefore, apes are intelligent. Now, what's wrong with this argument? Well, what's wrong with it is a pretty clear formal problem. We have an if-then conditional. Here's my antecedent. Here's my consequent. And if the antecedent is true, the conclusion should follow in a valid deductive argument. But what happens here is actually not that. What happens here is that what we state is true here, apes can solve puzzles, is actually the consequent. And then we're inferring from the consequent here to the antecedent. And this way of arguing in this direction doesn't work. It's an invalid argument form. The valid argument form, right, is if P, then Q, P, conclusion Q. And it can't go in the opposite direction and remain valid. So you can see why this is referred to as a formal fallacy. Just looking at the form of the argument, we can see that this attempted deductive argument has an argument form that mimics or imitates a valid argument form, but it actually fails to truly follow that argument form. So formal fallacies are always deductive arguments that are invalid. The arguments are actually invalid because the argument form is being used incorrectly. Now we will get back to formal fallacies in the next section of this course, but over the next 2 weeks we're going to be talking about informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are different in that you cannot identify the fallacy just by looking at the argument form itself. And so these are going to be inductive arguments where you have to understand the content of the argument, the meaning, the context of the argument in order to see the fallacy. Here's a good example given by Hurley. A chess player is a person, therefore a bad chess player is a bad person. Now on the surface of it, this looks like actually a pretty good deductive argument. There's actually nothing wrong with the form here. So what is wrong with this argument then? Why can't we say that if a chess player is a person, then a bad chess player is a bad person? Well, there's nothing about the form of the argument that went wrong here. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand that the word bad is being used in 2 different ways, and so the argument doesn't follow. A bad chess player just means that someone without skill at playing chess, whereas bad in the context of a bad person means someone who is ethically bad. So what we've done is, in between the first and the second part of the statement, we've changed the meaning of the word being used, and so it's no longer valid because even though the word looks like the same word, the word has 2 different meanings, in the different contexts, and so it's no longer a valid argument. I can't tell this just by the form of the argument. I have to understand the content. And that's also what makes informal fallacies somewhat difficult, is because you can't just say, here's an argument form, when you see it, it's always wrong. You have to understand the context in order to know that this is actually a bad form of inference. Now in section 3.2, Hurley will start talking about specific informal fallacy types and show us ways we can detect and avoid those in everyday conversations and arguments.